Hello, this is MJ. I'm back, and there's one thing I want to talk about very briefly. It's about a little bit about economics, a little bit about white supremacy, a little bit about communities of color, and the people who tie these things together. I often get questioned about people like Thomas Sowell. He comes up a lot, and I'm not sure how familiar some of you may be with his work, but Thomas Sowell was pretty much one of these people in league with people like Murray Rothbard. He was also under the tutelage at one time of the late Milton Friedman, and these people were more or less in the vein of laissez-faire, free market economics, which some may disagree with me. In my opinion, is still in a seminar. Somebody like Noam Chomsky. Always something. In the vein of free market economics, which in my opinion is still somewhat in a seminar or classroom. These things have only, I say, or think, been proven to be somewhat true in a very limited capacity, and maybe in a one-to-one capacity, even when you compare Keynesian models to Austrian models as far as a priori and a posteriori. Like, for instance, give you an example. Under a Keynesian model, you can almost predict who's going to be eating Lay's potato chips 40 years from now. Under an Austrian model, there are certain indicators that say you can't predict these things, no matter what. That life is just random, and economic demand may flow accordingly. But that's, maybe I'll talk about a little bit about that later. I don't want to turn this into a long lecture about economics. But I noticed a lot of people cite people like Thomas Sowell when there's a look and see problem, meaning like look and see, look at this group, and they're doing, or they're following these particular principles and so on and whatever. Okay, that's fine, that's great, but even when I was doing my undergrad, I noticed there's a lot of things that Thomas Sowell never really talked about. Even when you look back at some of the old videos from the show William F. Buckley had called Firing Line, Thomas Sowell was on there all the time. Or even on Tony Brown's journal, if anybody, if you're old as I am, you'll probably remember some of these things. But he never talks about, or at least not so much about, the systemic issues when we talk about race. When it talks about social mobility. Right? He very, very lightly touches those things. And I don't know if that's because Thomas Sowell himself has managed to get himself into a privileged class, very much like the black conservatives of the 1980s during the Reagan administration. That followed suit with Reaganomic policies only because they were in a position to do so. The idea, just very much like Sowell, was, I can do it, so therefore you can do it too. Not understanding that we still make modern day, a lot of people, especially white people, make these modern day comparisons, like when they look at somebody like LeBron James or somebody like that, or some black entertainer that makes millions of dollars, or some black businessman that's like somewhere in the 1%, and say, well, they did it, now how come everyone else can't do it, right? Well, by that same reasoning, then why aren't more white people doing it if that was the idea? But with black people not understanding that these people are more or less the exception than the rule. Because if it was the rule, then it would be, socioeconomically, black people's income would be closer on par than it is to white people. For example, you can look this up for yourself. In America today, just less than 10% of people make at least $100,000 a year. Within the black community, it's less than 2%. So you do the math. But I don't think people have studied people like Thomas Sowell enough, or at least pretty much not necessarily Sowell himself, but his ideology, which speaks privilege privileged class. I won't say privilege in and of itself, but privileged class. It speaks privileged class all day long. And I think that's where Thomas Sowell was missing the boat. He had a few books out, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, which basically talked about the class divide and why a lot of these people, even though they may be on different socioeconomic standing, how they were in vastly different boats based on the motivations at the time. And plus, and with that motivations at the time, I think the game is past people like Thomas Sowell. He's still talking. He almost sounds like a black leader today. When you listen to a lot about black leaders, they're not talking about anything now or necessarily in the future. They're always talking about something yesterday, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. We'll bring up these starlit points like, Black Wall Street, right? We'll bring up things like, the struggles after, Brown versus Board of Education and how it was a triumph and stuff like that. But nothing, I can't, at least nothing in my view, anyway, that I've noticed. It's been progressive moving forward. I don't think you're going to get that conversation out of Sowell. And from Sowell, it kind of breeds intuitively people like Candace Owens, if you're familiar with her. And for some reason, white people have managed to make people like Thomas Sowell and Candace Owens more or less the voice of the black community, as if that we're all a monolith that should necessarily listen or even bow and listen. And I don't think that's the case or should be the case in any capacity. I think if I had to compare the two, I would say people like Thomas Sowell is more of a true believer, right? Because he's made it. Granted, Candace Owens has made it, but I think she's only made it off her grifting. I think she's just in it for the money. I don't think she has any real philosophy behind it. She talks about or speaks on subjects she at best has tangential knowledge about. But there's nothing deeply epistemic about anything that she's saying. Nothing. Zero. And maybe you might be a bit more familiar than I am. I've never seen Candace Owens on a panel. As a side note, I make this same point to so-called Dr. Umar Johnson, Jermaine Shoemaker. You'll never see these people on a panel with other experts debating these issues. That should be a red flag to you. So I'd like to know what you think about my very, very brief summary in the comment section. Let me know what you think, whether you agree with it, disagree with it. Either way, I'm curious about your input, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.